Mom, you'll be better off there. You'll have nurses 24 hours a day and people your own age to talk to. Those were the words of my son Ricardo as he avoided looking me in the eye. But what he didn't know was that very same morning, hidden among his office folders, I had found the sales agreement for my own apartment for the sum of $45,000. My blood froze in that instant, not from the winter cold in the city, but from the coldness of the betrayal throbbing in the chest of the person to whom I gave my entire life. I had spent 25 years working 2 jobs, cleaning offices at dawn and doing the books for others at night, just to keep a decent roof over his head, and now that very roof became the prize for his greed. I remained in silence, feeling how the world I built with so much sacrifice crumbled beneath my feet, while my daughter-in-law Valeria smiled with that falseness that only vultures have before lunging at their prey. It was at that precise moment when I stopped being the self-sacrificing mother who forgave everything to become something they were not prepared to face. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, a day that seemed ordinary but was marked by fate to reveal to me the bitterest truth of my existence. I was returning from the market earlier than planned because I felt a little dizzy, and upon entering the house silently, I heard laughter coming from the main living room. They weren't laughs of family joy, but guffaws of victory, the kind celebrated when a dirty bet has been won. Valeria was saying that the Los Olivos nursing home was the cheapest in the outskirts, and that, with the $45,000 they would receive for my share of the apartment, they could finally pay the down payment on their new house at the golf club. Ricardo, my little Ricardo, whom I carried in my arms during nights of fever, did not protest, did not defend me. He simply nodded, saying it was about time they had a life of their own without an old woman getting in the way. That phrase hit me harder than any illness I have suffered in my 68 years of life. At what point did the boy who asked me for bedtime stories transform into this man who calculated the price of my freedom as if it were old merchandise? I felt a deep nausea, a void in my stomach that threatened to make me fall, but I held onto the wooden wall of the hallway. I looked at my hands, worn by detergent and years of processing invoices until dawn, and I understood that blind love is the shortest path to one's own destruction. But before moving forward with my story, I want to ask you a question that has been haunting me since that day, and I would like you to be honest in the comments. Tell me, do you believe a mother is obligated to sacrifice absolutely everything for her children, even if they prove they have no soul? Write what you think. I need to know if my reaction was fair in the eyes of others. That night I couldn't sleep. I spent the hours staring at the ceiling, remembering every cent I saved since 1999. I remember perfectly that my first significant salary was $550, and from there, I set aside $200 for the house fund. I bought secondhand clothes, walked 30 blocks to avoid spending on public transport, and many times I had only tea with bread for dinner so that Ricardo wouldn't lack his university books. The apartment where we live now, the one they wanted to sell behind my back, cost me exactly $82,000 in the year 2010, after a decade of absolute deprivation. I was the legal owner of 60%, while I had gifted him 40% as a graduation present, thinking that in doing so, I would give him security for his future. What a great mistake it was to confuse inheritance with gratitude. The next day, I decided to act as if I knew nothing, adopting a mask of fragility to make them believe their plan was working. Perfectly. I watched Valeria while she had breakfast, seeing how her eyes scanned the antique furniture, surely appraising them mentally to sell them in some antique shop. She spoke to me with a honeyed voice, telling me that in that new place, I would have painting classes and that the fresh air would be good for my lungs. I nodded my head, playing the part of a senile old woman, while inside my brain functioned at the speed of a high-end financial computer. It was then that I dropped the first bait, mentioning that I felt so tired that perhaps I should review my will and the life insurance I had kept in the bank's safety deposit box. I saw their eyes light up, as if they were 2 wolves facing a wounded sheep. Ricardo leaned forward, taking my hand with a hypocritical tenderness that gave me chills, and told me not to worry about anything, that they would take care of all the legal formalities so that I wouldn't have to move a single finger. I felt a glacial chill running down my spine, because I knew that what they called help was nothing more than the paperwork for my burial in life. But what my son didn't know, and what Valeria could never have imagined, was that I kept an old yellow envelope in my lawyer's office for 3 years, an envelope containing a truth capable of destroying their dreams of grandeur in a single second. However, before revealing the contents of that envelope to you, I must tell you what happened when I followed them in secret to the real estate agent's office. I put on my oldest coat, a headscarf, and dark glasses, and waited for them to leave the house to get into a taxi and asked the driver to follow them at a safe distance. They arrived at a modern office in the center of the city, a glass building that sparkled under the afternoon sun. I got out and hid behind a column, managing to see through the large window how they were signing some preliminary documents. There was my son's name, Ricardo Martinez, stamping his signature next to that of a fat, bald man who smiled smugly. They were selling my home, my refuge of 25 years of work, as if it were a simple shoebox. In that moment, the sadness that overwhelmed me evaporated, leaving in its place a cold and calculating rage. There were no more tears. There was only strategy. I returned home before them and locked myself in my room to review my own accounts. I had saved $14,200 in a secret account I had opened for medical emergencies, and furthermore, I possessed my mother's jewelry, which was valued at approximately $8,000 more. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to start my counterattack. The first thing I did was call my lawyer, Mr. Morales, a man who had known my story since I was widowed and who had always warned me about Valeria's ambition. Mr. Morales received me that very same afternoon, and as I explained the situation to him, his face filled with an indignation that I could no longer feel. He explained to me that, legally, since I was the owner of 60% of the property, no sale could be finalized without my notarized signature. However, Ricardo and Valeria were attempting procedural fraud, claiming that I was not in full possession of my mental faculties to obtain a legal guardianship that would allow them to seize my assets. My own son was trying to declare me insane to keep my money. That was the final blow to my mother's heart. From that moment on, I decided they would not have a single cent, not now and not ever. As I walked back, I passed a park where I saw other grandmothers playing with their grandchildren, and I felt a healthy envy. I would never have that because my family had rotted from the root. But instead of sitting down to cry, I went into a technology store and bought a small recording device, the kind that looks like an ordinary pen. I placed it on the dining room table that night, right before they arrived with a bottle of wine to celebrate, supposedly my future move to the nursing home. What I recorded in the next 2 hours was so dark, so full of contempt toward me, that even today, months later, it is hard for me to listen to it again without feeling my soul break into pieces. Ricardo said he was already fed up with the house smelling like an old woman's food, and that Valeria couldn't wait to decorate the room I occupied to turn it into a luxury walk-in closet. They spoke of me as if I were a cumbersome object, an old suitcase that no longer closed properly and only took up space in the attic. You realize, my dear viewer, that sometimes the enemy is not outside, but sits at your table and calls you Mom. But the story was about to take a turn they never saw coming, because my son did not know that I had kept that old yellow envelope I mentioned before, and that envelope contained the secret that would change the fate of us all. Before I tell you what that document said and how I managed to leave them on the street, with a single phone call, I want to ask you a small favor. If this story is reaching your heart and you want to know how this lesson in justice ends, make sure to subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss the moment Valeria discovers that her dream of living in the golf club turns into a nightmare of debts and lawsuits. Subscribe now and turn on the bell, because what comes next is the exact moment the sheep sheds its skin to show it was always a lion protecting its territory. The yellow envelope contained proof that the money Ricardo had used to buy his 40% of the apartment was not his, but came from a loan I had formally made to him before a notary 7 years ago, a loan he never repaid. According to the clauses of that contract, if it was not settled within the stipulated time frame, the property would return entirely to my hands. He had forgotten it, thinking Mom would never collect a favor, but I was never just a mother. I was also an accountant. And in the world of numbers, debts do not forgive, not even between blood of the same blood. On Friday morning, I woke up with a calm that scared even me. I prepared coffee, served breakfast, and waited for them to come down. Valeria came dressed in designer sportswear, already feeling like part of high society, while Ricardo checked his phone, probably coordinating the buyer's visit. I sat at the head of the table and placed the yellow envelope in front of them. Ricardo looked at me with curiosity and asked what it was. I only answered him with a voice I didn't recognize as mine, a voice that sounded like steel in a firm sentence. I told him it was the reckoning for his betrayal and the notice that they had 72 hours to vacate my property. Valeria let out a shrill laugh, saying I was delusional and would soon be in the nursing home where I belonged. But her laughter died out when Ricardo opened the envelope and began to read the document. His face went from red to ash white in a matter of seconds. His hands began to tremble so much that the paper crackled loudly in the silence of the kitchen. He knew perfectly well that the contract was legal, that it was duly registered, and that the lack of payments for 84 consecutive months granted the creditor, that is me, the immediate execution of the mortgage guarantee over his percentage of the property. I felt no satisfaction at that moment, only a profound sadness seeing how his greed had blinded him to the only person who truly loved him. Valeria, seeing that her husband was not reacting, snatched the paper from him and began shouting insults, calling me a miserable, crazy old woman. I stood up with an elegance I didn't know I possessed, walked to the door and told them my bags were already packed, but not to go to the nursing home, but to go on a trip around the world with the money I would get from selling the apartment on my own, since now 100% of the property was legally mine. $55,780 was the actual market value if sold urgently, and I already had a serious buyer, a newlywed couple who would value the home I built with so much sweat. Ricardo tried to kneel, asking for my forgiveness, saying Valeria had pressured him, that he didn't want to hurt me. But I remembered the pen recording. I remembered their mocking laughter and their contempt for my old woman smell. I put my hand on his shoulder, not with affection, but to move him out of my way, and told him the mother he knew had died the afternoon he signed that sales contract behind my back. That same afternoon, Mr. Morales arrived with a restraining order and the eviction documents. Valeria tried to break some vases and furniture before leaving, but the police were already at the door, alerted by my lawyer. Seeing them leave my house with their belongings in trash bags was an image I will never forget. Not because it was an act of revenge, but because it was the purest act of justice I have ever witnessed. They went to live in a small rented apartment in a dangerous part of the city, losing the deposits they had given for their house in the golf club. Money that, by the way, they had also stolen from my personal savings through an electronic transfer that my lawyer also managed to track down. The silence that remained in the house after their departure was heavy, almost solid, as if the walls themselves were breathing a sigh of relief after years of enduring the poison of their whispered conversations in the kitchen. I sat in my green velvet armchair, the one I bought with my first Christmas bonus in the year 2005, and closed my eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what I had just done. I had kicked my only son out onto the street, but in my chest, I felt no guilt, only a crystal clear clarity that I had never experienced before in my 68 years of life. Betrayal has a particular scent, a smell of dampness and age, and my house was steeped in it thanks to Valeria's presence and Ricardo's weakness. I stood up and opened all the windows, letting the fresh afternoon air in to carry away the remnants of their hypocrisy, while my mind began to calculate the next step of my reconstruction. What they didn't know, and what Mr. Morales was finishing investigating, was the exact root of the $38,420 that had disappeared from my retirement savings account over the last 2 years. I trusted Ricardo completely. I had given him access to my banking passwords because my eyes could no longer see the small print on the cell phone screen clearly, and he took advantage of that physical blindness to steal my financial soul. Every transfer of $1,500, every ATM withdrawal of $500 that I didn't recognize, was now documented in a black leather folder on my dining table. These were proofs of a crime of breach of trust and electronic fraud that, if presented to the prosecutor's office, could put my own son behind bars for a long time. I felt a lump in my throat thinking about him in a cell, but then I remembered the word nursing home and Valeria's smile, and the lump transformed into a stone wall. I remember perfectly the effort it took me to gather every cent of those $38,000, because for a woman of my generation in this country, money does not fall from the sky. It is torn from the earth with one's fingernails. In the year 2008, when the crisis hit everyone, I worked 12 hours a day as the head of cleaning at the city's central hospital, and at night, I prepared 500 empanadas to sell at fairs on the weekends. My feet would swell so much that I had to wear shoes 2 sizes too large, and my hands always smelled of bleach and onions, a smell Ricardo hated and mocked when he was a teenager. I did it for him so he could study at that private university where he met the woman who ended up corrupting the little good I had sown in his heart. Seeing the figures of his thefts on paper was like seeing the scars of a battle I lost by trusting the wrong enemy. But fate has very strange ways of balancing the scales, and while I was checking the drawers they left empty in their hasty flight, I found something that completely changed my perspective on the conflict. Under the mattress in the guest room, where Valeria kept her secrets, I found a small amber-colored dropper bottle without a label, hidden inside an old sock. My intuition as a mother and as a woman who has seen everything in hospitals told me that this was no common medicine, so I immediately called my friend Elena, who is a retired pharmacist. What she revealed to me after analyzing the contents in her private laboratory made me feel the ground disappear beneath my feet for the second time in less than a week. Valeria didn't just want my money and my house. She was, accelerating my physical deterioration with substances that clouded my mind and weakened my heart. This is where the story turns dark, much darker than any mother could imagine in her worst nightmares, and it makes me wonder how far human evil can go for a few green bills. She gave me those drops in my afternoon tea, telling me they were vitamins for my memory, when in reality they were potent sedatives, combined with a diuretic that kept me exhausted and confused. That was why I felt dizzy, why I forgot where I left my keys, why they had the perfect argument to say that I could no longer live alone. Before I continue with the account of how I confronted them with this terrifying truth, tell me in the comments, would you forgive a son who allows his wife to try to extinguish the life of his own mother for an inheritance? Your answers will help me understand if my next move was too cruel or simply necessary. With the proof of the poisoning in my hands, the game of politeness was over, forever, giving way to a war of survival where I held all the cards. On Monday morning, I showed up at the bank branch where Ricardo worked as a junior credit manager, dressed in my best steel gray tailored suit and with the black leather folder under my arm. I entered his office unannounced, watching how his face became distorted upon seeing me there, standing firm, without the trembling in my hands that Valeria's drops had caused me for months. I placed the laboratory report and the summary of the fraudulent bank movements on his desk, which totaled exactly $38,420.16. The silence in that office was so dense that you could hear the second hand of the wall clock ticking away the end of his professional career. Ricardo tried to stammer an apology, tried to tell me that Valeria had threatened to leave him and take the children if he didn't get the money for the new house. I laughed, a bitter, dry laugh that came from deep within my gut, because I realized that my son was a coward who preferred to see his mother die rather than face his own matrimonial reality. I told him he had exactly 60 minutes to transfer every stolen cent back to my personal account, including the interest calculated at 12% annually that he himself used to charge his clients. If the money was not reflected in my balance within 1 hour, Mr. Morales, who was waiting outside in the hallway, would enter to hand over the criminal complaint to the bank director. I watched as his fingers trembled over the keyboard, sweat beading on his forehead as he carried out the operations that dismantled his lie of prosperity. Within 45 minutes, my cell phone vibrated with the notification of 3 massive transfers that restored stability to my financial future. But I did not stop there, because the money was only a part of the debt they owed me for the attempt to harm me physically. I demanded that he sign an irrevocable waiver of any inheritance rights over my present and future assets, a total and absolute disinheritance that would be recorded before a notary that very afternoon. He signed with eyes full of tears, but I no longer saw my son. I saw a stranger who had allowed them to give me poison in my own cup of tea. But the biggest surprise was not the money, but what I discovered when I returned home and began to deep clean the room they had occupied. At the back of a closet, I found a small safe whose combination was Ricardo's date of birth, something that seemed like a poetic irony on his part. Upon opening it, I did not find jewelry or more money, but a series of letters handwritten by Ricardo's father, my late husband Alberto, dated months before his death in the year 1997. In those letters, Alberto asked a distant relative abroad to look after a Swiss account he had opened for me, an account I never knew anything about because he died suddenly of a heart attack. Ricardo knew. He had found those letters years ago and had been keeping that secret to collect it when I was no longer in this world. The amount in that Swiss account, added to the interest accumulated over nearly 3 decades, was a figure that would allow me not only to travel the world, but to buy an entire building if I so desired. We are talking about 250,000 Swiss francs that had been waiting for me while I cleaned floors and counted coins to pay for electricity. My son's betrayal was not just about the apartment and the local savings. It was a long-term plan to inherit a fortune he considered his by-blood right, regardless of the fact that to obtain it, he had to see me suffer in a cheap nursing home. At that moment, sitting on the floor of his old room, I understood that life was giving me a second chance, a golden retirement that I earned with every tear and every drop of sweat. Before telling you how I used that fortune to give them the final lesson and how Valeria ended up working in the very same hospital where I used to clean the bathrooms, I want to remind you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Justice is slow, but it arrives, and the end of this story is so satisfying that you will want to share it with everyone you know so that no one ever underestimates the power of a mother who decides to stop being a victim. Turn on the bell, because what I am going to reveal to you about the final fate of Ricardo and the mansion they could never have will show you that karma has perfect accounting and never makes a mistake in its balances. I hired a team of private investigators to watch Valeria's every move, Because I knew a woman of her kind would not give up so easily, I discovered that she was already looking for lawyers to contest the contract for the house, claiming that I had obtained it under duress. Poor fools! They didn't know that I now had the resources to hire the best law firm in the country, men, who charged $500 an hour and did not lose a single trial. While they sank into legal debts, I decided to put the apartment up for sale immediately, closing the deal in record time for $58,000 in cash, and I moved to a luxury hotel while I looked for my new residence facing the sea in a distant city where no one knew my past. Ricardo called me one night, crying, saying that Valeria had left him upon finding out he no longer had access to my inheritance and that she had taken the children to her mother's house. He asked me for rent money, saying he had been fired from the bank following the internal audit triggered by my visit. I listened to him in silence, savoring a glass of red wine that cost more than his current monthly payment, and I remembered the moment he told me that I would be better off in the nursing home. I answered him with the same phrase, with the same icy and distant tone he used with me. Ricardo, son, in that small and damp apartment you will be better off. You will have time to reflect on what the word loyalty means. Then I hung up and blocked his number forever, erasing the last link that tied me to my old life of useless sacrifices. My trip to Switzerland was not a vacation. It was a pilgrimage toward my own freedom and the final accounting of a life of underpaid sacrifices. I arrived in Zurich on Thursday, May 14th, with the cold of the Alps reminding me that the world is vast and that my kitchen in that city apartment was not the limit of my existence. I presented myself at the private bank on Bahnhofstrasse, carrying with me Alberto's original passport and the letters my son had tried to hide from me for so many years. The manager, a white-haired man named Herr Schmidt, received me with a bow that no one had ever given me in my years as a cleaning lady or a neighborhood accountant. Upon opening the records, my eyes filled with tears at the sight of the exact figure written on officials' paper: 254,320 Swiss francs and 8 cents. Alberto had been saving every commission from his international sales since 1985, thinking of a retirement he never got to enjoy, but which now became my shield against the moral misery of my own offspring. People often say that money doesn't buy happiness, but they are profoundly wrong because money buys the necessary distance to keep the snakes away from your garden. With those funds, the first thing I did was hire a team of medical specialists to cleanse my system of the remains of that poison Valeria had been giving me in my tea. The blood tests revealed alarming levels of benzodiazepines and liver toxins that would have ended my life in less than a year if I hadn't discovered the amber bottle. I spent 3 weeks at a recovery clinic in the Alps, where each therapy session cost 950 francs, but every cent was worth it as I felt the mental fog vanish and my strength return. My skin, once withered by stress and poor nutrition, regained its glow, and my hands stopped trembling, allowing me to write again with the firmness of a woman who has regained control of her destiny. But while I was healing, my lawyer back home, Mr. Morales, was preparing the final blow for those who thought I was an old woman who was easy to discard. Valeria thought that by keeping the old furniture and the designer clothes she stole from me, she had won the war, but she didn't know that justice has a perfect accounting system that never forgets a pending balance. We initiated a criminal lawsuit for attempted homicide and the administration of harmful substances using the Swiss clinic's report and the pen recordings as irrefutable evidence. The prosecutor's office had no doubts upon seeing the evidence of the purchases she made at clandestine pharmacies, spending exactly $3,200 on controlled medications without a medical prescription. The trial was swift and devastating for her. Since she had no money for a good lawyer, she ended up being represented by a public defender who could not prevent her sentence. She was sentenced to 8 years of house arrest with an electronic bracelet and an absolute disqualification from holding any public or private position related to the care of others. But the most ironic twist was that, to pay the $20,000 civil fines the judge imposed on her, she had to accept the only job her record would allow: cleaning the floors of the central hospital. Yes, the woman who mocked my hands for smelling like bleach now spends 10 hours a day scrubbing the same hallways I scrubbed to pay for her husband's degree. Fate put her exactly where she believed I belonged, dressed in a worn blue uniform and receiving orders from supervisors who have no mercy for her laziness. Every time she dips the mop into the bucket of disinfectant, I hope she remembers the taste of the tea she served me with so much contained hatred. As for Ricardo, he fell into a spiral of debt that even his best financial projections could not predict. Having been fired from the bank for a lack of professional ethics, no other financial institution wanted to hire him, and he ended up working at a gas station on the outskirts of the city, pumping gas for a minimum wage of $650 a month. His credit cards, which totaled a debt of $15,800, were canceled, and his assets were seized to cover the loans he took out in the name of my apartment. Sometimes I wonder if he ever feels regret when he sees his reflection in the glass of the cars he services, or if he continues to blame bad luck for his steep fall. But the reality is that it wasn't bad luck. It was the logical consequence of having put a price on the life of the woman who gave him his own. I, meanwhile, decided never to return to that city full of gray memories and family, betrayals that smell of dampness. I bought a small villa facing the sea in a fishing village on the Mediterranean coast, a property of 120 square meters with a garden full of bougainvilleas and lemons. It cost me $185,000, paid in cash, and every morning I wake up to the sound of the waves instead of my daughter-in-law's screams demanding money. I have learned that loneliness is not a punishment, but a luxury that only those at peace with themselves can afford to fully enjoy. In my new house, I have a room dedicated exclusively to my books and my accounts, because even though I no longer need to work, I still keep a detailed record of my daily expenses. €30 at the market, €12 for fresh flowers, €60 for a dinner facing the harbor with my new friends, women who have also survived their own storms. My life now has a positive balance, not only in the bank but in my soul, and I have learned to forgive myself for having loved so much that I forgot to protect myself. The yellow envelope that was once the symbol of my pain now rests in a silver frame on my desk, as a reminder that the truth always finds its way to the surface no matter how much dirt they throw on top of it. The morale of my story is simple but powerful. Never underestimate a woman who has learned to count her own coins, because she will know exactly when your time has run out. Before saying goodbye, I want to thank you for accompanying me on this long and painful journey from betrayal to total redemption. If my story has served to open your eyes about the people around you, then every tear I shed will have had a noble purpose. Remember that no matter how many times they tell you that you are worth nothing or that you are a nuisance, your value does not depend on the opinion of others, but on the strength with which you decide to defend your dignity. Do not allow anyone to sell your house, your dreams, or your peace of mind under the excuse of family love or convenience. Real love does not ask for sacrifices that destroy the other. Real love builds bridges, not prisons disguised as nursing homes. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that it is always possible to start over, regardless of age or circumstances. Tell me one last thing in the comments before you go. What would you do with a family secret that could change your life, but meant walking away forever from those you love? Would you choose the truth or the comfort of a known lie? I will love reading your final reflections on this life balance that I've shared with all of you today. Your words are the best payment for this accountant who has finally closed her books and decided to live the rest of her days under the sun, without debts of love and with a heart in surplus. Thank you for being here, for listening to every detail of my rebirth, and for being part of this community that values justice above all else. Until the next story, where the truth will always be the absolute protagonist and karma will take care of putting every figure in its corresponding place. My life now is an ocean of calm where numbers are no longer concerns, but simple footnotes to a story of personal success. At 70 years old, I feel younger than when I was 40, because the weight of betrayal no longer bows my back or clouds my gaze toward the horizon. Ricardo tried to send me one last letter, written on a crumpled piece of paper from the gas station, asking me for a chance to explain everything, but I burned it without opening it in the fireplace of my new living room. There are no explanations that can erase the fact that he allowed them to poison me for $45,000 miserable dollars. The fire consumed his words just as I consumed my fears, leaving only ashes that the sea breeze took care of scattering through the garden. My final balance is closed, the audit of my life is over, and the result is a peace that has no price in any currency in the world.